Considering other impacted projects. So because this is a kind of a new consideration under our applications, I wanted to take a little bit more time and kind of help you work through some considerations. So an obvious example might be, you know, if you're requesting the tablets and the tablets go with the software, but they're separate projects, if we don't fund you the software, you have no use for the tablets, right? If we don't fund you the tablets, but you have the software, then you could say, well, the software is going to be less effective if we don't have the tablets. And it helps us know, right? And we're not just blindly like, here you go, congratulations, you get these projects. And you're like, well, great, you're kind of out of touch because now this isn't that useful because I don't have that project. So this really helps us really remember kind of some of your local limitations and what you're facing. And I did it again, but replacement vehicles and preventive maintenance funds is another example I talked about earlier. You know, if you don't get replacement vehicles, your preventive maintenance budget in theory might increase. So let us know that and consider that too, right? When you're building out a preventive maintenance budget, kind of consider that. That possibility that you're not going to be getting replacement vehicles, even if awarded, they're not probably coming into your fleet for a good year and a half. So really be considering that when you're going through your budgeting process. Shop equipment and preventive maintenance, right? You know, maybe you want to bring in some equipment that allows you to do more in-house service that would reduce your maintenance costs for going through a third-party garage. If you don't get that shop equipment, does your preventive maintenance budget get impacted? You know, really be thinking about the synergies between your projects, operating assistance and planning projects. If you're like, hey, I really would love a planning project to do this route effectiveness survey or whatever it may be, and if I do that, then we'll create efficiencies in operating costs and all that. But if you don't get that, how might that impact your operating assistance? Rolling stock and equipment. If you request 15 radios and some of those radios are going to be applied towards vehicles you're getting, but you don't get them, will that reduce the radio equipment that you need, as an example? And these are just generic examples. We've not asked this question in the past, so I don't have examples. I'll be sure to get those for future workshops, but these are just kind of things to try to get your mind kind of rolling on, okay, I'm going to start considering that and making sure that I'm connecting those dots for ODOT, and so that when they are considering my application, they're really considering it holistically. Vehicles, I want to call this out again because this is always an issue for us. And so while it might not be a best practice, I do want to take time to reiterate it again that, you know, vehicle cost worksheets have to be completed for each vehicle request. So under the related documents, and this is again for those vehicles being purchased off of our state term contract, not the vehicles being procured locally. But for those vehicles, if you have requests for a modified minivan and you're requesting 3, you will create a tab or complete a tab for each of those requests on the MMV worksheet. So I really want to make sure that this is staying in your mind of how to do this appropriately, because it's going to be very important for us when we're considering your project that this is done right. And this seems to be a common tripping point for people that are requesting vehicles. So just really, really remember, treat them each individually. Double check project information. So here are some common reasons that your application might be returned for correction. The wrong attachments are uploaded. So someone accidentally uploads their application certification and their authorizing resolution. You know, just quickly clicking, you know, they both start with A, whatever it may be, but just double check. When you're in FormStack, I do believe you can see the name once you've uploaded it. Just make sure that it's there. We have situations where when you're going through the project sections and we're saying, hey, what's the ODOT assistance required? What's the local assistance being contributed? And therefore, this is the total project cost. You know, in the project sections, you'll put one thing, and then in your supporting documentation that you're attaching, it says something completely different. And then we're like, which one is correct? So just making sure that anything you're attaching as support to a project request is consistent with what the actual fields say in your application. Excuse me. Make sure that the authorized official has signed all the documents. So, we have application certifications, local match certifications, these things that require signature, and it can't just be anyone. Whoever is authorized in that authorizing resolution as, being able to submit applications on the organization's behalf needs to be the one that has signed it, or we can't accept it. But also just making sure that you have signed everything. So that kind of brings me to the checklist. The checklist has been modified from past applications since it's all combined into one now, but in the checklist, we're going to speak to those forms that require signature. So, we create this checklist for your benefit because it is a lot of information. We understand that. So trying to summarize this in a helpful checklist is something we understand would be very useful for you, but it's only useful if you actually reference it. So that the checklist will be loaded under the related documents. Please take a look at it before you hit submit and just double check. Consider your timeline to complete the application. So we do have documents that might require board or commissioner approval, authorizing resolutions, certifications, and assurances. So, consider that. If your board doesn't meet until the end of April, but you don't even start the application until the third week of April, and now you're like, oh no, I need all this stuff and I can't get on the agenda. I don't, it's like, well, I don't know what to tell you. You really need to think about all those things when you're building out this timeline. So, on that point, don't wait until the last day, because if there is something you're like, oh man, my local process dictates that this gets, 3 levels of approval, we can't anticipate that. That's kind of on you to understand and prepare for. And so, if you're on the last day and you're like, oh, I just realized this, well, there was 5 weeks, right? And I don't mean to sound unforgiving, but we have timelines. If we want to get our stuff done for you to get funds secured, we have timelines we have to meet, and that's why they are set up the way they are. They're not suggestions, they're deadlines. So, the other thing we've run into, especially with the LOI, is, people were waiting till the last day, and let's say someone was out sick and they email them or call them and they're like, hey, I'm doing the LOI and I ran into this problem. And now, someone from ODOT wasn't available to answer that question at the 12th hour. That's kind of, on the local for not kind of working through that. That's just a risk you take, right? I mean, technically the application isn't due until May 4th. So technically you have until May 4th, but that's the risk you take if you want to push that out, that there might be a situation where you have a question go unanswered and you just have to submit to the best of your ability. So by doing this workshop and telling you in advance what's going to be required for the projects and the application, taking a look at this presentation ahead of time, getting your answers, questions asked and answered ahead of time, that's a best practice in being successful. And so on that note, account for technical issues, outages, illnesses. No applications will be accepted after the due date. So if, you're waiting till 11:58 p.m. on May 4th and then FormStack crashes, that is really, really unfortunate. But we're gonna be really limited in what we can do to help you at that point. So I understand that you guys are very busy and, your objective is to deliver public transportation and not so much, worrying about funding applications, but this is, a necessary evil to our relationship. So, please plan in advance, ask your questions. We're happy to answer them, but, be realistic in your expectations of us too. There's over 100 people applying, so that could be a lot of questions to respond to. So just remember that. Okay, So I want to go ahead and test your knowledge. And there's only 3 questions that I'm going to ask, just to kind of reiterate maybe some of those important things that we want you to remember. And then once we get through this, we can actually go to questions and open it up for discussion. So that's how I really want to use the rest of our time. Okay. So in the questions pod, answer true or false to these questions. And then Paula, if you could kind of just call out what they're answering, I will wait just like a few moments and then I'll reveal the answer.
Sure, we have all falses.
All falses. Okay, so you should save attachments as you go. A lot of people are answering false. That is correct. Attachments do not save. Upload them at the time of submission. Question 2, an application should be submitted for each project request.
We have all falses again.
Good job. False. One application should be submitted for all project requests. Again, the only disclaimer there is if you're rural, you have rural and urban projects, those would be separate applications, but still for all projects within those areas. Last question. All required forms and templates for the application will be accessed via the ODOT website.
This one is trues.
True. True. Applicants will access all required forms and the application checklist on the ODOT website. Okay. So before we jump into any questions that have been submitted in the questions pod, I do want to again reiterate that we have created a transit programs mailbox. So when you email this address, all of the program staff have access to that transit inbox. So that just allows us to make sure that we can get a response to you as quickly as possible and that the appropriate person can reach out to you. So with that, you might be accustomed to reaching out to a specific program staff member, but for the application purposes, for 2023 program year application, we are requesting that those questions be sent to this email because again, it aids in our responsiveness to your questions. 2, it serves as a central repository for the question. So if we're getting a question over and over again, it probably indicates that there's clarification that's needed, and it allows us to look at those questions holistically and say, okay, you know what, we're going to make a statement to all applicants to clarify this. And then we can also update an FAQ and have one location where those questions were submitted. So please jot this down. This is where we're going to request that you again send your questions. If you would like a phone call, you're like, oh, I have like 7 questions I want to work through. It would be so much easier to have a phone call. Again, just email this and say, I'm working on my application. I have questions. I would love to have a phone call, whatever, and we can respond to you and coordinate that and make sure that the appropriate person calls you and helps you work through your application. It helps us manage our time better because we are managing the closeout of one calendar year, the administering the current calendar year, and then now preparing for the next one. So we have a lot of irons on fire. So this really helps us make sure we can be responsive to you and plan for addressing some of your concerns.